Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping through a different kind of doorway, not into legend or fantasy, but into the cold reality of stone and hierarchy, of privilege and labor, of gaslight and formality. You won't find fairy tales here, just the heavy truth of what it meant to live within the walls of a Victorian mansion, whether you owned the deed or scrubbed the floors. If these quiet explorations of the past help ease you toward rest, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly bring you peace. And if you'd like to support our channel's journey through history's quieter corners, your help means more than you know. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, what time it is where you are, and if you have any energy left to send our way. There's something oddly comforting about knowing others are drifting off to the same slow walk through time. So, settle in. Let the imagined crackle of a coal fire warm the edges of your mind. And let's begin with the grand facade and what truly lay behind it. The facade and what it promised. Picture, if you will, a structure rising from manicured grounds. Not a castle, not a cottage, but something deliberately between. A Victorian mansion in its prime, somewhere in the decades between 1840 and 1900. The architecture speaks before you even approach the door. Gothic Revival spires reaching toward gray British skies. Italianate towers with their rounded arches. Queen Anne asymmetry with turrets placed just so. Bay windows jutting out at unexpected angles. Red brick or golden stone, depending on the quarry and the owner's taste. These were not homes built for subtlety. They were statements carved in masonry, declarations of wealth, power, and permanence. The approach itself tells you something. A gravel drive curves through grounds that employ at least 3 gardeners, possibly 5. Hedges trimmed to geometric perfection. Flower beds arranged by season and color, each bloom in its assigned place. In the distance, a greenhouse glints with glass panes, sheltering exotic specimens that require constant attention. A fountain, perhaps, or statuary imported from Italy. Everything designed to impress before you've even reached the entrance. The front door is imposing. Heavy oak or mahogany, with brass fixtures polished to mirror brightness. A porter's bell pull hangs beside it, connected to a system of bells throughout the house. Pull that cord, and somewhere in the servants' quarters, a specific bell rings, announcing your arrival. But if you're important enough, you won't need to pull it yourself. A footman will have spotted your carriage from a window and alerted the household. The door will swing open before you've even stepped down from your conveyance. Inside, the entrance hall stretches upward and outward. These spaces were designed to create a specific feeling. That first breath-catching moment when a visitor understands exactly how wealthy the family truly is. The ceiling soars overhead, perhaps 2 stories high. A grand staircase dominates the space, its banisters carved from expensive wood or wrought in decorative iron. The floor might be marble, might be encaustic tiles in elaborate patterns, might be polished wood covered with Persian carpets. Every surface reflects the gaslight, Or, later in the era, the new electric bulbs that still seem almost magical. But this is only what you're meant to see. Behind this carefully constructed facade lies a different world entirely. A world of strict hierarchy, endless labor, precise ritual, and suffocating expectation. The Victorian mansion wasn't a single home, but a collection of parallel universes existing within the same walls. The family above stairs living lives of carefully choreographed leisure. The servants below stairs making that leisure possible through hours of invisible work. The two worlds intersecting only at specific, prescribed moments, following rules as rigid as any legal code. The mansion itself was a machine, really. A complex mechanism requiring constant maintenance, perpetual feeding, endless adjustment. It consumed coal by the ton, water by the barrel, food by the cartload. It required an army of workers to keep it functioning. And it demanded above all else the appearance of effortlessness. Everything had to look easy, natural, as if meals prepared themselves, and floors cleaned themselves, and fires burned without anyone tending them. This was the great illusion of the Victorian mansion, that wealth bought not just comfort, but the invisibility of labor. That one could live surrounded by luxury without acknowledging the human cost of maintaining it. That the family upstairs could believe, perhaps even genuinely, that their lives of leisure were simply the natural order of things, rather than a carefully constructed performance made possible by dozens of people working themselves to exhaustion just out of sight. The mansion was a machine, really, a complex mechanism requiring constant maintenance, perpetual feeding, endless adjustment. It consumed coal by the ton, water by the barrel, food by the cartload. It required an army of workers to keep it functioning, and it demanded above all else the appearance of effortlessness. This was the great illusion of the Victorian mansion, that wealth bought not just comfort, but the invisibility of labor, that one could live surrounded by luxury without acknowledging the human cost of maintaining it, that the family upstairs could believe, perhaps even genuinely, that their lives of leisure were simply the natural order of things, rather than a carefully constructed performance made possible by dozens of people working themselves to exhaustion just out of sight. Tonight, we'll walk through this world slowly, room by room, roll by roll. We'll see what the family saw and what they didn't. We'll spend time in the servants' quarters where the real work happened. We'll sit through elaborate dinners and stand through boring social calls. We'll watch the sun rise over a house that never truly sleeps, and we'll watch it set on a world that would, within a few decades, cease to exist in this form. The Victorian mansion was a moment in time, a specific arrangement of people and privilege that couldn't last. The First World War would shatter it. Economic changes would erode it. Social movements would challenge the assumptions on which it was built. But for several decades, it represented the peak of a certain kind of British domestic life. And understanding it means understanding not just how the wealthy lived, but how an entire society organized itself around principles of class, service, and hierarchy that seem almost alien to us now. So, let's step inside. Let's see this world as it actually was, not as it's been romanticized in period dramas and novels. Let's feel the cold of those grand rooms in winter, smell the coal smoke that permeated everything, hear the constant rustle of servants moving just out of sight. Let's understand what it meant to live in a Victorian mansion, whether you slept in the master bedroom or on a lumpy mattress in the attic. Because both experiences were real, and both were shaped by the same rigid system that made one person's comfort dependent on another person's endless labor. The architecture of separation. The Victorian mansion wasn't designed by accident. Every wall, every staircase, every corridor served a purpose beyond shelter. The building itself was a physical manifestation of Victorian values, a three-dimensional representation of how they believed the world should be organized. And chief among these values was the importance of separation. Separation between the family and the servants. Separation between public and private spaces. Separation between the messy realities of daily life and the polished facade presented to the world. Walk through the front door and you entered what might be called the public zone, the entrance hall we've already described. Beyond it, the drawing room where guests were received. The library, lined with books that may or may not have been read. The dining room, with its massive table capable of seating 12 or more. These were performance spaces, stages on which the family acted out their roles as cultured, refined members of the upper class. Every object in these rooms was chosen for its ability to impress, to demonstrate taste, to signal wealth without being so obvious as to be vulgar. The drawing room embodied this perfectly. Large windows faced the grounds, allowing natural light, but also allowing the family to be seen, to be observed, being leisurely and refined. Furniture arranged in conversational groupings. Chairs and settees upholstered in rich fabrics that required constant care. A piano in the corner, because musical accomplishment was expected of young ladies. Art on the walls, perhaps originals, perhaps good copies, always tasteful. Heavy curtains that could be drawn against the cold or the sun or prying eyes. A fireplace with an ornate mantel displaying carefully chosen objects. Nothing in this room happened by chance. Move through the house and you'd find more public spaces. Perhaps a morning room where the lady of the house received social calls. A billiard room where gentlemen could retire after dinner. A conservatory attached to the back of the house, filled with ferns and palms and other plants that suggested both scientific interest and the wealth to maintain such things. Each room had its purpose, its rules, its proper inhabitants at proper times. But running parallel to these grand spaces was another world entirely. The service areas were designed to be as invisible as possible to the family and their guests. A maze of narrow corridors, steep staircases, cramped rooms tucked into corners and basements and attics. This was where the actual work of the household happened, and the architecture reflected that brutal practicality. The kitchen was typically in the basement or a ground floor extension at the rear of the house, far from the dining room, deliberately so. The Victorians didn't want to smell cooking or hear the clatter of pots or be reminded that their elaborate meals required actual labor. The kitchen was hot, smoky, cramped despite its size. A massive cast-iron range dominated one wall, requiring constant feeding with coal. The range heated the room to unbearable temperatures in summer and barely adequate warmth in winter, because all the heat went up the chimney or into the cooking. Surrounding the kitchen were the other service rooms. The scullery, where the dirtiest work happened, where vegetables were scrubbed and dishes were washed in water that was never quite hot enough. The pantry for storing dry goods. The larder for keeping things cool, before the age of refrigeration, with stone shelves and sometimes ice brought from an ice house on the grounds. The servants' hall, where the staff took their meals, a plain room with a long table and hard benches, no decoration, no comfort, just function. The back stairs were crucial to the whole system. These narrow, steep staircases allowed servants to move between floors without using the main stairs, without being seen by the family or guests. A housemaid could carry coal up to the bedrooms at 5 in the morning, invisible and silent. A footman could descend from the dining room to the kitchen to fetch the next course without traversing any space the family occupied. The architecture made the labor invisible, which was exactly the point. In the attics, tucked under the eaves where the ceiling sloped so low you could barely stand upright, were the servants' bedrooms. Small rooms, often shared between 2 or 3 people. A simple iron bedstead, a thin mattress stuffed with horsehair or straw. A single chair, perhaps. A small mirror. Maybe a washstand with a chipped basin and jug. No heat except what might rise from the rooms below. In winter, ice formed on the inside of the windows. In summer, the space became an oven. Privacy was nearly non-existent. The senior servants might have their own rooms, but the lower staff shared, sleeping shoulder to shoulder, their few possessions kept in a wooden box under the bed. The separation extended to the grounds as well. The front gardens were for show, but around the back you'd find the working areas. The kitchen garden, where vegetables grew in neat rows. The stables housing the horses and carriages, with living quarters above for the grooms and stable boys. The coal stores, holding the fuel that kept the entire house running. The ice house, half buried, where ice cut from frozen ponds in winter was stored in sawdust to last through summer. The laundry buildings, separate from the main house because the steam and the smell were considered too unpleasant for the family to encounter. The governess occupied perhaps the strangest position of all. She was educated, often gently born, but fallen on hard times. She taught the children, but wasn't quite a servant and wasn't quite family. Too elevated to eat with the lower servants, too low to dine with the family, she often took meals alone in her room. Her position was inherently precarious, dependent entirely on the family's goodwill, with no real security or prospects beyond finding another family to employ her. Charles Dickens and Charlotte Bronte captured her isolated status in their novels because they understood it from the inside. The footman stood tall and young and decorative. Families preferred tall footmen because height was impressive. Footmen wore livery, distinctive uniforms that announced the household's wealth and status. They served at table, answered the door, accompanied the family on outings, and performed various tasks that required a presentable male face. A footman might earn 15 to 25 pounds a year, plus his room, board, and uniform. It was considered a good position with potential for advancement to butler. The housemaids formed the bulk of the female staff. The head housemaid had responsibility for supervising the others. Under her came the parlor maid, who cleaned the public rooms, the chambermaids, who handled the bedrooms, the between maid, who assisted wherever needed. At the bottom was the scullery maid, often a girl of 12 or 14, earning perhaps £5 a year and doing the hardest, dirtiest work imaginable. She scrubbed pots, washed dishes, cleaned floors on her hands and knees, emptied chamber pots, and performed any task considered too low for the other servants. The kitchen maid assisted the cook, preparing vegetables, washing up, keeping the kitchen fires burning. The laundry maid dealt with the endless washing, using harsh lye soap that destroyed her hands and working in clouds of steam that left her perpetually damp. The nursery maid cared for young children, changing nappies, entertaining fractious toddlers, walking them in the park, and receiving little thanks for work that was both exhausting and crucial. Outside, the household required more staff. The coachman managed the stables and drove the family's carriage. The groom and stable boy, who might be as young as 10, cared for the horses, cleaned tack, and mucked out stalls. The head gardener supervised his team of under-gardeners, who maintained the extensive grounds. Some houses employed a gamekeeper to manage the hunting on the estate. This hierarchy wasn't just about job descriptions. It determined where you slept, what you ate, how you dressed, who you could speak to, and how you were addressed. The upper servants had their own sitting rooms, separate from the lower servants. They took tea in relative comfort, while the lower servants ate in the servants' hall. The upper servants wore better clothes, enjoyed more time off, and were treated with more respect. Meals below stairs reflected this hierarchy perfectly. The butler and housekeeper sat at the head of the table. The upper servants sat nearest them. The lower servants sat further down, according to their rank. Food was served in order of precedence. The best portions went to the senior staff. What was left went to those at the bottom. Everyone knew their place. Everyone maintained it. Form of address mattered enormously. The butler and housekeeper were always Mr. and Mrs. The cook was always cook. The housekeeper and lady's maid might be called by their surnames. The lower servants were often called by their first names, or worse, by generic names assigned to their positions. Multiple housemaids might all be called Mary, regardless of their actual names, because it was easier for the family than remembering individual identities. Servants were expected to be invisible. If you encountered a family member in a corridor, you pressed yourself against the wall, averted your eyes, and pretended to be furniture. You never spoke unless spoken to. You never made eye contact unless instructed. You moved silently, worked silently, existed silently. The perfect servant was one who anticipated needs before they were expressed and vanished the moment the task was complete. Yet this same hierarchy provided structure and even opportunity. A girl might enter service at 12 as a scullery maid earning almost nothing. But if she worked hard, learned her tasks, caused no trouble, she might advance to kitchen maid, then housemaid, then perhaps head housemaid. The upper positions offered relative comfort, better wages, more respect. A career in service, while hard, was more secure than many alternatives available to working-class women. The hierarchy also created its own social world. Servants formed friendships, fell in love, quarreled and gossiped within the constraints of their positions. The staff quarters had their own dramas, their own hierarchies within hierarchies, their own rules and customs that existed parallel to, but separate from, the family's world above stairs. This system, rigid as it was, began to crack in the late Victorian period. By the 1880s and 1890s, servants were starting to question their place. Why should one person serve another simply because of birth? Why should hard work earn so little reward? Why should respect flow only upward, never down? These questions would eventually contribute to the system's collapse. But for now, in the height of the Victorian era, the hierarchy held firm, enforced by custom, law, and the architecture of the mansion itself. The day above stairs. Dawn breaks over the mansion, though you wouldn't know it in most bedrooms where heavy curtains keep the world at bay. But someone knows. Someone is already awake, already working, already ensuring that when the family rises, everything will be perfect. This is the invisible choreography of the Victorian morning, and it begins long before the people who own this house open their eyes. The master of the house wakes to a room already warm, thanks to a housemaid who crept in while it was still dark to lay and light the fire. She entered silently, worked quickly, and vanished before he stirred. On his bedside table, placed there by his valet the night before, is his pocket watch. The time is perhaps 8 in the morning. He rises, crosses to the washstand where his shaving water has been prepared, exactly the right temperature, changed twice already this morning to maintain that perfection. His valet appears, somehow always knowing exactly when he's needed. Together, in silence or near silence, the ritual of dressing begins. The Victorians didn't just put on clothes. They constructed themselves, layer by layer, into the people society expected them to be. For a gentleman, this meant first the undergarments, then the shirt with its separate collar and cuffs, then the waistcoat, then the jacket, then the cravat tied just so. Each piece had to be perfect, because appearance was everything. A wrinkled collar could damage one's reputation faster than a financial scandal. The master descends to breakfast, which has been laid out in the breakfast room, or perhaps the dining room. The table gleams with silver chafing dishes, keeping food warm. Eggs, bacon, sausages, kidneys, kippers, toast, marmalade, tea, coffee, all ready at precisely the expected time. He serves himself from the buffet, a footman standing ready to assist, but otherwise invisible. He reads the morning newspaper, delivered earlier by a boy who never entered the house proper. The paper was ironed dry before being presented, because damp newsprint would be unacceptable. The mistress of the house rises later, perhaps 9 or half past. Her morning is similar but different. Her lady's maid helps her dress, a more complex operation, because women's clothing in this era is architectural. Corsets must be laced, petticoats layered, the dress buttoned up the back with tiny buttons that no woman could manage alone. Hair must be arranged, a process that can take an hour for the elaborate styles fashion demands. She must look perfect, effortless, as if she simply woke this beautiful. After her own breakfast, she retires to the morning room for what seems like leisure, but is actually work. The housekeeper arrives for the daily conference. They review yesterday's accounts, discuss today's menu, address any issues with staff or supplies. This meeting might last half an hour, during which the mistress makes dozens of decisions that will affect the entire household. How many guests for dinner? What should be served? Has the linen been properly inventoried? Is there a problem with any of the servants? This is her domain, her responsibility. A Victorian lady might not work in the sense that her servants do, but managing a household of this size and complexity is work. She must know the cost of everything, the quality of every supplier, the capabilities of every servant. She must plan weeks in advance for major entertainments. She must maintain standards that reflect well on her husband's status. One mistake, one dinner party that goes wrong, and the social consequences can be severe. The master descends to breakfast, which has been laid out in the breakfast room, or perhaps the dining room. The table gleams with silver chafing dishes, keeping food warm. Eggs, bacon, sausages, kidneys, kippers, toast, marmalade, tea, coffee, all ready at precisely the expected time. He serves himself from the buffet, a footman standing ready to assist, but otherwise invisible. He reads the morning newspaper, delivered earlier by a boy who never entered the house proper. The paper was ironed dry before being presented, because damp newsprint would be unacceptable. The mistress of the house rises later, perhaps 9 or half past. Her morning is similar but different. Her lady's maid helps her dress, a more complex operation, because women's clothing in this era is architectural. Corsets must be laced, petticoats layered, the dress buttoned up the back with tiny buttons that no woman could manage alone. Hair must be arranged, a process that can take an hour for the elaborate styles fashion demands. She must look perfect, effortless, as if she simply woke this beautiful. After her own breakfast, she retires to the morning room for what seems like leisure, but is actually work. The housekeeper arrives for the daily conference. They review yesterday's accounts, discuss today's menu, address any issues with staff or supplies. This meeting might last half an hour, during which the mistress makes dozens of decisions that will affect the entire household. How many guests for dinner? What should be served? Has the linen been properly inventoried? Is there a problem with any of the servants? This is her domain, her responsibility. A Victorian lady might not work in the sense that her servants do, but managing a household of this size and complexity is work. She must know the cost of everything, the quality of every supplier, the capabilities of every servant. She must plan weeks in advance for major entertainments. She must maintain standards that reflect well on her husband's status. One mistake, one dinner party that goes wrong,
and the social consequences can be severe. The morning might bring social calls. The Victorian ritual of calling was elaborate and rule-bound. You called at specific hours, left your card if the lady wasn't home or wasn't receiving, stayed exactly 15 minutes if you were received, discussed only appropriate topics. The mistress might make calls herself, accompanied by a maid, dressed in her calling costume, a performance of respectability and refinement. Or the morning might be spent on correspondence. Letters were the lifeblood of Victorian social life. Thank you notes for dinner invitations, invitations sent and received, letters to relatives, all written by hand in her best script, on quality paper, sealed with wax, addressed properly. The rules governing correspondence were as strict as any other aspect of life. The wrong paper or the wrong form of address could give offense. The children, if they appear at all during these morning hours, are
The master might retire to his study for business matters. A Victorian gentleman with wealth had investments to manage, correspondence to handle, decisions to make. He might meet with his steward, or his banker, or his solicitor. He might spend the afternoon at his club in town, if the family maintains a London residence during the season. He might go riding or shooting, if the estate includes such amenities. The mistress might return to her correspondence or her needlework. She might practice the piano, a skill ladies are expected to maintain. She might read, though the choice of reading material matters. Novels are acceptable, but not too many. Religious texts are always appropriate. Conduct books and domestic management guides are praiseworthy. Her afternoon is both leisure and performance, time that must be filled appropriately, demonstrating the refinement and cultivation that marks her class. Tea at 4 or half past is another ritual. The servants bring tea and cakes to the drawing room. The family might gather, or the mistress might take tea alone, or there might be guests. Tea is social glue, the excuse for conversation, for maintaining the relationships that matter in Victorian society. The hostess pours, demonstrating her domestic skills. The conversation is light, pleasant, carefully neutral. The late afternoon brings preparation for dinner, the main meal and the main event of each day. The mistress might change her dress again, because one doesn't wear morning clothes to dinner, even when dining privately. The master returns from wherever he spent his afternoon, changes into evening clothes with his valet's assistance. The house shifts gear, moving toward the elaborate production that Victorian dinner represents. This is the day above stairs, a day filled with ritual and rule, with appearance and performance, with comfort purchased by others' labor. To an outsider, it might look lazy, purposeless, empty. But to the Victorians, this was the proper way to live. This demonstrated that one had achieved success, had risen above the need to work with one's hands, had earned the privilege of leisure. Every ritual reinforced their place in society. Every form observed proved they belonged to the class that mattered. Yet it's worth noting what's missing from this day. No real productive labor. No creation of anything useful. Time filled with rituals that serve mainly to fill time. The Victorian upper classes had so thoroughly separated themselves from the production of wealth that they often didn't even understand where their money came from. The factory owner might never visit his factory. The landlord might never see his tenants. The investment income arrived magically, and with it the right to live this careful, circumscribed, ultimately rather empty existence. Boredom was a constant problem, especially for women. They couldn't work, couldn't study beyond a certain level, couldn't participate in public life, couldn't express ambition or intelligence too obviously. So they filled their days with rituals, with social performance, with the elaborate game of maintaining status through proper behavior. Some found real satisfaction in managing their households well. Others quietly went mad from the constraints. Most endured, because this was simply how things were done, and questioning it was unthinkable. The day below stairs. While the family sleeps, the house is already awake. The servant's day begins in darkness, begins with cold, begins with the knowledge that everything they will do today must be invisible to the people above stairs. This is the real work of the mansion, the labor that makes the facade possible. 4 in the morning, perhaps earlier in winter. The scullery maid wakes in her attic room where frost has formed on the inside of the window. She shares this room with 2 other maids, and they wake together, silently, dressing in the dark because candles cost money and must be used sparingly. She splashes icy water on her face from the basin, pulls on her dress, her apron, her cap. Her fingers are numb with cold as she buttons her boots. Down the back stairs to the kitchen, moving quietly because waking the family would be a catastrophe. The kitchen is cold and dark. Her first task is the range, that massive iron beast that dominates the room. She rakes out yesterday's ashes, a dirty job that leaves her covered in soot. She lays fresh coal, kindles the fire, waits for it to catch. This is crucial work. Without the range burning properly, nothing else can happen. No hot water, no cooking, no heat for the rooms above. While the range heats, she fills kettles and pots with water from the pump. Water is heavy, pots are heavy, and she makes trip after trip. She scrubs the kitchen table, cleans the grates, begins the endless work of washing up from yesterday. There are always dishes, always pots, always something that needs cleaning. Her hands are red and raw from the harsh soap and cold water. She is perhaps 14 years old. The cook arrives around 5, and now the real work of preparing breakfast begins. Eggs must be boiled just so, bacon fried, toast made on the range and kept warm. The cook issues orders in a constant stream, and the scullery maid and kitchen maid jump to obey. There's no time for mistakes, no patience for slowness. The food must be ready exactly when the family expects it, must be perfect, must be hot. Around the same time, the housemaids are beginning their rounds. The lower housemaids tackle the dirtiest work first.
carrying coal up the back stairs to each bedroom, enough to keep the fires burning all day. This means climbing narrow, steep stairs over and over, carrying heavy scuttles, breathing hard. Then comes the ash, carried back down. Only then can they lay and light the fires in the family's rooms, working silently so as not to wake anyone. Once the fires are burning, they clean the grates in the downstairs rooms, sweep the floors, dust every surface. The drawing room must be perfect before the family descends. Not a speck of dust, not a cushion out of place. The housemaid works on her knees, scrubbing the marble floor of the entrance hall, her back aching, her hands raw. She must finish before the family wakes, must make herself invisible before they appear. The footmen have their own morning routine, cleaning and trimming lamps if the house hasn't yet converted to gas or electric light, laying out the silver for breakfast, standing ready in the dining room, invisible as furniture, waiting to serve. A footman might stand for hours without moving, without complaint, muscles cramped, never showing discomfort.
The butler descends from his room, which is slightly better than the servants' quarters, but hardly luxurious. He checks that everything is in order, that the servants have done their work properly. He may taste the wine intended for dinner, checking that it's at the proper temperature, not turned. His role is supervisory now, but he started as a hall boy or footman, worked his way up through decades of service. He knows every task because he once performed them all. Breakfast for the servants happens when the family's breakfast is done. They gather in the servants' hall, sitting in strict order of precedence. The butler and housekeeper at the head, the lower servants at the far end. The food is adequate but not luxurious. Porridge, perhaps, bread and dripping, tea. The leftovers from the family's table, if there are any. They eat quickly because there's work waiting. Conversation is muted, carefully neutral. Everyone is exhausted already, and the day has barely begun. After breakfast, the real work of the day unfolds. The housemaids strip beds, change linens, dust and sweep every room again, because dust accumulates with shocking speed. They black the grates, polish a grass, wash the windows, beat the carpets. The labor is endless, and much of it is invisible. The family never sees it happening, which is exactly the point. The kitchen is in constant motion. Luncheon must be prepared. Then dinner, that elaborate multi-course production that can take hours to cook and minutes to consume. The cook orchestrates it all, shouting orders, checking pots, tasting constantly. The kitchen maids chop vegetables, prepare stocks, wash up the morning's dishes while creating new ones. The scullery maid is on her feet all day, her back aching, her hands bleeding from cuts and burns, and the constant immersion in water. The lady's maid has a different day, but no less demanding. She spends hours in her mistress's room, caring for the elaborate wardrobe that Victorian fashion requires. Dresses must be brushed, spots removed, ribbons pressed. She might spend an entire afternoon mending a torn flounce or matching a button. When her mistress needs to change clothes, she must be there instantly, ready to unlace and lace, unbutton and button, arrange hair, adjust hat, ensure perfection. The laundry maid faces perhaps the worst work of all. Laundry in the Victorian era was brutal labor. The soiled linens and clothes of an entire household, washed by hand in huge tubs using harsh soap and boiling water. She scrubs and pounds and wrings until her arms ache. Then everything must be hung to dry, whether it's raining or not. Then ironed, using heavy flat irons heated on the stove. The room is thick with steam, unbearably hot, and she works until the last piece is done. The afternoon brings no rest. There are always tasks waiting. Silver to polish, furniture to wax, mending to do. The housekeeper makes her rounds, checking that everything is as it should be, noting any deficiency, any laziness. The servants move quickly, speak quietly, stay invisible. Dinner preparation consumes the late afternoon. This is the meal that matters, the one that must be perfect. Multiple courses must be ready simultaneously, each at the exact right temperature, each presented beautifully. The footmen rehearse their serving choreography because every movement must be precise, coordinated, graceful. Any clumsiness will be noted, criticized, possibly punished. While the family dines in elegant comfort, the servants wait. Footmen stand ready to serve the next course, to pour wine, to respond to any need. The kitchen staff keeps food hot, worries over dishes not yet sent up, prepares the next course. Only when the family has finished, when the last dish has been cleared, can the servants eat their own dinner. Servants' dinner is the leftovers, if there are any. Otherwise, it's simple food, filling but dull. Stews and bread and tea. They eat fast because there's still work to do. All those dishes from the family's dinner must be washed. The kitchen must be cleaned and prepared for tomorrow. The dining room must be put back in order. By the time the servants finish for the day, it might be 10 at night, might be later. They climb the back stairs to their cold attic rooms. Perhaps they have an hour to themselves before sleep. Perhaps not even that. Some mend their own clothes by candlelight. Some write letters home, though many are barely literate. Some simply collapse into bed, too tired to do anything else. They wake in 4 or 5 hours to do it all again. 6 days a week, with perhaps half a day off on Sunday, if they're lucky. This is service. This is the price of the family's comfort. These are the invisible hands that make the mansion function, and the family above barely think about them at all. Dining and the theater of status. The dining room at night is transformed. Candelabras glow on the long table. Crystal glasses sparkle in rows beside each place setting. Fine china, painted with the family crest, waits to receive food. Silver serving pieces line the sideboard, polished to mirror brightness. The curtains are drawn against the dark outside, creating an intimate space despite the room's size. This is the theater where the Victorian family performs their most important daily ritual. Dinner in a Victorian mansion wasn't simply eating. It was a carefully choreographed display of wealth, taste, and social position. The meal might last 2 hours or more, course after course, each served with precision, each governed by elaborate rules of etiquette that everyone was expected to know and follow. The family and any guests gather first in the drawing room. This is social time, light conversation, perhaps a glass of sherry. The timing is precise, announced by a gong sounded by a footman. When the butler announces that dinner is served, the procession to the dining room begins. This isn't casual. The host escorts the highest-ranking female guest. Other pairings are determined by strict rules of precedence. Who escorts whom? Who sits where? All of this matters intensely. In the dining room, seating follows a plan the hostess has agonized over. The most important guests sit nearest the host and hostess. Couples are never seated together. That would waste the opportunity for broader conversation. People of similar interests should be near each other, but not too near. The whole arrangement is strategic, designed to promote the right conversations, display the right connections, avoid any social awkwardness. In the dining room, seating follows a plan the hostess has agonized over. The most important guests sit nearest the host and hostess. Couples are never seated together. That would waste the opportunity for broader conversation. People of similar interests should be near each other, but not too near. The whole arrangement is strategic, designed to promote the right conversations, display the right connections, avoid any social awkwardness. In the dining room, seating follows a plan the hostess has agonized over. The most important guests sit nearest the host and hostess. Couples are never seated together. That would waste the opportunity for broader conversation. People of similar interests should be near each other, but not too near. The whole arrangement is strategic, designed to promote the right conversations, display the right connections, avoid any social awkwardness. The meal begins with soup, served from a tureen at the head of the table, or brought already plated by footmen. In wealthier households, footmen stand behind each chair, ready to serve, to pour wine, to respond to any need. In slightly less grand establishments, dishes are passed family style, though still with formality. Either way, the rules are strict. You begin eating when the hostess begins. You use the correct utensil for each course. You never reach across the table. You never speak with your mouth full. After soup comes fish, a separate course requiring its own specialized utensils. Fish knives and forks were a Victorian innovation. Another way to demonstrate that you knew the rules, that you belonged to the class that cared about such things. The fish course might be salmon, turbot, sole, prepared with elaborate sauces, garnished beautifully. A footman serves, offering the dish from the left, wine from the right, following rules that have been drilled into him through endless practice. Then comes the meat course, or rather courses, plural. Roast beef, or venison, or mutton. Perhaps game birds in season. Multiple meats might be offered simultaneously, with appropriate vegetables and sauces. Potatoes prepared 3 different ways. Asparagus if it's spring. Everything arranged on the plate with thought to color and composition, because presentation matters almost as much as taste. Between courses, the footmen clear with synchronized efficiency. Plates removed, table crumbed, fresh settings placed. The family and guests barely pause in their conversation. This is when the performance happens, the careful dance of social interaction. Topics are chosen carefully. Politics might be discussed, but not too heatedly. Religion similarly. Personal matters are avoided unless the company is very intimate. The weather is always safe. Literature and art are appropriate. The conversation must be light but not trivial, engaging but not controversial. The ladies demonstrate their accomplishments through this conversation. They show they are educated but not pedantic, informed but not aggressive, charming but not forward. The gentlemen display their wit, their knowledge of the world, their business acumen, without being so crude as to discuss actual money. Everyone performs, and everyone judges everyone else's performance. Then comes game, if it's the season, or perhaps a savory course, something to cleanse the palate before sweets. The meal builds in complexity, in richness. By this point, even the best appetite is flagging, but one must continue. Not finishing each course would be noticed, commented upon, possibly interpreted as criticism of the meal. The sweet course arrives in glory. Elaborate confections created by the cook and her staff over hours of work. Trifles and charlottes and jellies molded into architectural forms. Fruit compotes and cream. Everything decorated, everything designed to impress. The footmen serve with extra care, because these dishes are fragile, and any spill would be disaster. Finally, fruit and cheese, though by this point no one can possibly be hungry. This course is more symbol than sustenance. Grapes and apples and pears arranged artfully. Multiple cheeses with appropriate accompaniments. Port is poured for the gentlemen, though the ladies might take a small glass. And then, in formal dinners, comes the moment of separation. The hostess catches the eye of the most important female guest and rises. All the ladies rise with her and process out to the drawing room for coffee and conversation, leaving the gentlemen alone with their port and cigars. This separation might last 30 minutes or more, during which the gentlemen discuss business, politics, anything unsuitable for feminine ears. The ladies in the drawing room discuss whatever ladies discuss, probably including commentary on the dinner and the male guests. When the gentlemen finally rejoin the ladies in the drawing room, there might be music. The daughter of the house might play piano or sing, demonstrating her accomplishments. There might be cards or other gentle games. The evening winds down slowly, conversation becoming more relaxed as the wine takes effect. Finally, the guests depart, the family retires, and the servants begin the enormous task of cleaning up. But dining wasn't just about the family's meals. The servants ate too, in the servants' hall, in their own hierarchy. The butler and housekeeper at the head of the table, the upper servants nearest them, the lower servants further down. They ate the leftovers from the family's table when there were any, otherwise simpler food, filling but plain. They ate quickly because time off was precious and rare. The kitchen staff ate last and worst, grabbing whatever they could while cleaning up the enormous mess that dinner preparation created. The scullery maid might not sit down until 10 at night, might eat standing up, too tired to care what she's eating as long as it fills the hollow ache in her stomach. Dining also extended to entertaining guests for dinner parties, which happened regularly in any socially active household. These were even more elaborate affairs, testing the household's capabilities to their limit. Perhaps 12 guests, which meant 12 extra place settings of the best china, crystal, and silver. It meant a more elaborate menu, more courses, more of everything. It meant the servants worked even longer hours, slept even less, but received no extra pay. The morning after such a dinner, the hostess worried over every detail. Did the fish course arrive on time? Was the wine the right temperature? Did Lady So-and-so seem offended by her seating? Did the conversation flow properly? Was anything said that shouldn't have been? Her social position depended on getting these events right, and the pressure was intense. The cook worried about different things. Did the roast brown properly? Was the sauce too thin? Did anything fail to arrive at the table at the right temperature? Her position depended on her culinary skill, and one bad dinner could damage her reputation permanently. The servants worried about their performance. Did anyone stumble while serving? Were any glasses knocked over? Did anyone speak out of turn or make themselves visible in the wrong way? Their jobs depended on invisible perfection, and any mistake could have consequences. This is what dining meant in the Victorian mansion. Not just eating, but performance, display, judgment, hierarchy, and anxiety, all wrapped up in multiple courses and governed by rules so complex they required written guides. It was theater where everyone played their assigned role, and any deviation from the script was noticed, commented upon, and remembered. The technology of comfort. The Victorian mansion was a house in transition, caught between the old world and the new, between candles and electricity, between chamber pots and flush toilets, between fireplaces and central heating. These decades saw dramatic changes in how houses functioned, and the mansion reflected this in complicated, often half-implemented ways. Early in the period, lighting meant candles or oil lamps. Candles required constant attention. They guttered, dripped wax, needed trimming, and provided relatively dim, flickering light. The wealthy used beeswax candles, which burned cleaner than tallow, but both required servants to manage them constantly. Trimming wicks, replacing spent candles, cleaning candlesticks, dealing with melted wax. These were daily chores. A house might go through hundreds of candles in a week. Oil lamps, particularly colza lamps, offered brighter light, but came with their own problems. They needed filling, cleaning, adjustment. The colza lamps made a constant sucking sound as they burned, an irritating background noise everyone learned to ignore. Later, kerosene lamps improved matters, burning brighter and cleaner, but they still required constant maintenance. Then came gas lighting, revolutionary for those who could afford it. Gas pipes ran through the house to fixtures in each room. Turn a valve, apply a match, and you had reliable light. No more candle trimming, no more lamp filling. But gas lighting brought new problems. The fixtures needed cleaning as the gas deposited residue. The smell was noticeable, sometimes unpleasant, and gas leaks were dangerous, occasionally deadly. Every gas fixture represented potential danger, and servants were trained to check for leaks to ensure valves were properly closed. By the end of the Victorian era, the most advanced households installed electric lighting. This seemed almost magical at first, impossibly modern. Flip a switch, Nothing more, and light appeared. No flame, no smell, no danger. But electric lighting was expensive to install and required a generating system. Many houses went electric room by room over years, creating a patchwork of old and new technologies existing side by side. Heating was another constant challenge. The fireplaces that made Victorian rooms habitable required endless attention. Coal had to be carried up from the basement coal store, a job that fell to the lower servants. In a house with 30 or 40 fireplaces, this meant tons of coal moved by hand every week. Each fireplace needed laying, lighting, tending throughout the day. Ashes had to be removed every morning. Another dirty job, another load to carry down the back stairs. The result was that Victorian rooms were either too hot or too cold, and often both. Stand near the fire and you roasted. Move a few feet away and you froze. Heat distribution was terrible because the fire heated the air immediately around it, while the walls and windows leaked warmth to the outside. The family bundled in layers of clothing even indoors. The servants, moving constantly through their work, froze in the unheated parts of the house and sweated in the kitchen. Some later Victorian houses experimented with central heating systems. Hot water or steam radiators fed from a coal-fired boiler in the basement. These worked well in theory, but had serious drawbacks in practice. The systems were expensive to install and operate. They broke down frequently. They provided uneven heat, some rooms baking while others froze. And they still required someone to tend the boiler, feed it coal, maintain the water level. A new job, but just as demanding as the old ones. Water was another complexity. Early Victorian mansions often lacked running water entirely. Water came from a well or cistern and was carried wherever it was needed. Washing, cooking, bathing all required hauling water. The labor was immense and fell entirely on the servants. A single bath for the mistress might require 20 trips up the stairs with heavy buckets. Later in the period, piped water became more common, at least in urban mansions connected to city water systems. This was revolutionary, changing the entire rhythm of household work. Taps in the kitchen meant no more water hauling for cooking. But most houses were slow to install plumbing throughout. Water might reach the kitchen, but not the upper floors. Bedroom washstands still required servants to bring hot water in pitchers every morning and evening. Hot water was particularly problematic. It had to be heated on the range or in a separate boiler, then carried to wherever it was needed. The rich might have the luxury of a fixed bathtub in a bathroom by the late Victorian period, but filling it meant either carrying hot water from the kitchen or waiting for a primitive water heater to do its work. Many hot water systems ran on gas, with all the attendant dangers of gas leaks and explosions. Bathrooms themselves were rare in early Victorian mansions. People washed at bedroom washstands and used chamber pots or made trips to outdoor privies. The idea of a dedicated room for bathing was new and somewhat strange. When bathrooms were added, they were often awkward conversions of existing spaces, tucked under stairs or carved out of large bedrooms. They had fixed bathtubs, often encased in wooden boxes to look like furniture, and later flush toilets. Flush toilets were their own revolution. The technology existed by the early Victorian period, but implementation was slow. The sewage had to go somewhere, and most houses weren't initially designed for it. Some toilets drained to cesspools that had to be emptied periodically, a disgusting job typically done at night by workers called night soil men. Later, connection to city sewer systems solved this problem, but only in urban areas. Country houses struggled with waste disposal for decades longer. The bathroom as we know it, with a sink, toilet, and bathtub all in one room, was a late Victorian luxury. Most houses, even large ones, made do with wash basins in bedrooms, portable tubs for bathing, and chamber pots or water closets separated from bathing areas. The servants emptied the chamber pots, dealt with the waste, maintained the pretense that such unpleasant biological necessities didn't exist. Laundry was yet another technological challenge. Washing clothes and linens was brutal work in the Victorian era. Everything was done by hand in large tubs using harsh soap. The laundry maid spent hours scrubbing, rinsing, wringing out heavy, waterlogged fabrics. Then everything had to be hung to dry, which in rainy Britain meant uncertain success. Then came ironing, using heavy flat irons heated on the stove. Hot, dangerous, and exhausting work. Some wealthy households built separate laundry buildings away from the main house because the steam and smell were considered too unpleasant to be nearby. These had their own boilers, their own drying rooms, their own equipment. The laundry staff worked there in isolation, producing the clean linens and clothing the family required while remaining invisible. Cooking technology advanced somewhat during the Victoria period. The massive iron ranges were improvements over open hearth cooking, offering better heat control and multiple burners. But they still required constant attention, constant coal feeding, constant temperature management. The cook became expert at judging heat levels, knowing which part of the range was hottest, timing everything to converge at serving time. It was skilled, difficult work, performed in incredible heat and constant pressure. Some later houses experimented with gas cookers, which offered easier temperature control and less heat output. But many cooks distrusted them, preferring the familiar range despite its difficulties. Innovation came slowly to the kitchen, partly because the people making the decisions, the wealthy families, didn't do the cooking and didn't fully understand the challenges. Refrigeration was primitive or non-existent for most of the Victorian period. Food preservation meant salting, smoking, pickling, or storing in cool larders. Ice houses, where ice cut from frozen ponds in winter was stored in sawdust underground, provided some cooling for those wealthy enough to have them. But ice cream and other frozen desserts were rare luxuries, impressive precisely because they were so difficult to produce. The telegraph and later the telephone connected some Victorian mansions to the broader world, though these were late Victorian additions and not universal. Having a telephone was a mark of being very modern, very connected, very wealthy. The instruments were kept in studies or morning rooms, and their use was carefully controlled. Servants might be forbidden to use them at all. All these technologies, all these changes, created a house that was neither fully traditional nor fully modern. A Victorian mansion might have electric lights in the drawing room, but candles in the bedrooms. Running water in the kitchen, but washstands upstairs. Central heating in some rooms, but fireplaces in others. It was a world in transition, experiencing changes that would transform domestic life. But the transformation was incomplete, uneven, often frustrating. And through it all, the burden fell heaviest on the servants, who had to manage whatever systems existed, old or new. They carried the coal, trimmed the wicks, filled the lamps, tended the fires, hauled the water, dealt with the chamber pots, operated equipment they often didn't fully understand. Technology was supposed to make life easier, but in the Victorian mansion, it often just changed the nature of the work without reducing it. Health, medicine, and mortality. Disease was no respecter of wealth. The Victorian mansion, for all its grandeur and all its servants, couldn't protect its inhabitants from the medical realities of the age. Illness visited regularly, and when it came, it brought fear, suffering, and often death. The Victorians understood they were vulnerable, and that understanding shaped how they lived. The family might employ a physician, a man of some standing, who made house calls when summoned. But medical knowledge in the Victorian era was limited and sometimes actively harmful. Doctors still believed in humors, in bloodletting, in treatments that often made patients worse. Common illnesses struck without warning. Influenza swept through households, leaving everyone weak and miserable for weeks. Pneumonia killed healthy adults within days. Tuberculosis, called consumption, was a lingering death sentence, slowly destroying the lungs while the victim grew thinner and paler, coughing blood. There was no cure, no real treatment, just supportive care and hope. The children were especially vulnerable. Childhood diseases that we barely think about today were killers in the Victorian era. Scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, measles, they all took their toll. Many families lost children, sometimes multiple children, to diseases that struck fast and hard. The nursery could become a sick room with shocking speed, and when it did, the entire household held its breath and waited. Childbirth was dangerous. Even wealthy women with access to the best medical care died in childbirth or shortly after from infections, from bleeding, from complications no one knew how to treat. The maternal mortality rate was high enough that every pregnancy carried real risk. Women wrote farewell letters before their confinements, letters to be opened if they didn't survive. They weren't being overly dramatic, they were being realistic. The servants faced all these dangers and more. Working conditions increased their vulnerability. The scullery maid, with her hands constantly in water, developed infections. The housemaid breathing coal dust while sweeping grates developed lung problems. The cook, working in intense heat and poor ventilation, suffered from respiratory ailments. They had less access to medical care, less time to recover, and any serious illness could mean dismissal. Accidents were common. A kitchen maid burned by the range, a footman who fell on icy back stairs and broke his leg, a laundry maid scalded by steam. The mansion was full of dangers, and the servants navigated them daily, often working even when injured, because stopping work meant no pay, possibly losing their position entirely. Mental illness was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. Depression, what the Victorians called melancholia, was seen as a moral failing or a weakness of character. Anxiety was dismissed. More serious mental illnesses might result in the person being sent to an asylum, those grim institutions that focused more on containment than treatment. The wealthy might hide a family member's mental illness, keeping them in a remote room, cared for by a devoted servant who was sworn to secrecy. Addiction was another hidden problem. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was freely available and widely used for everything from headaches to crying babies. Many Victorian women became dependent on it, taking it daily for ailments real and imagined. The same was true of other patent medicines, most of which contained alcohol, cocaine, or opiates. The addiction was often unintentional, but no less real. Hygiene practices were improving during the Victorian period, but remained inadequate by modern standards. People bathed far less frequently than we do, partly because bathing was such a production. Once a week was common, even among the wealthy. The poor might bathe once a month or less. Everyone smelled, though polite society pretended not to notice. Dental care was primitive and painful. Toothaches were common and often ended with extraction, done without effective anesthesia for much of the period. Tooth decay was widespread, bad breath was common, and by middle age, many people had lost most of their teeth. False teeth existed, but were expensive and uncomfortable. The wealthy suffered along with the poor, though they could afford slightly better solutions. The Victorian era did see significant public health improvements. The connection between sanitation and disease was gradually understood. Sewer systems were built in cities, dramatically reducing cholera and typhoid. Clean water supplies saved countless lives. These changes happened slowly, unevenly, with the wealthy benefiting first, but eventually they touched everyone. Vaccination against smallpox was available and gradually became more accepted, though there was resistance based on religious objections, distrust of medical authority, and simple fear of the procedure. Those who were vaccinated had a much better chance of surviving smallpox, one of the era's major killers. Those who weren't took their chances. The sick room became a familiar space in most households. When someone fell seriously ill, one bedroom was given over to nursing care. The curtains were kept drawn because fresh air and sunlight were considered dangerous for the sick. The room was kept warm, often too warm. Visitors were limited. A nurse might be hired, or a female relative would take on nursing duties. Care consisted mainly of making the patient comfortable, offering whatever food they could keep down, and waiting. Death, when it came, happened at home. People died in their beds, surrounded by family, not in hospitals. The moment of death was witnessed, accepted, grieved over immediately and openly. The body was washed and dressed by female family members or trusted servants, laid out in the bedroom, and mourned there before burial. Mourning was elaborate and strictly regulated. When someone died, the household went into mourning, with specific rules about clothing, behavior, and social interaction. For a close family member, the mourning period could last a year or more. Widows wore black for at least a year, sometimes for life. The family ceased entertaining, attending parties, engaging in any activity that might be considered joyful. This was expected, proper, the only acceptable response to death. The servants mourned too, in their own way, wearing black armbands or simpler black clothes, but they couldn't stop working. The household still had to function, meals still had to be prepared, fires still had to be tended. Grief was a luxury the servants couldn't fully afford. All of this, the illness, the injury, the death, created an atmosphere in Victorian households that is hard for us to fully grasp. Medical vulnerability was simply part of life. Every fever might be the start of something deadly. Every cough might be consumption. Every pregnancy might end in death. They lived with this uncertainty, dealt with it, developed elaborate rituals around it, but couldn't escape it. The mansion offered comfort, shelter, warmth, but it couldn't offer real security. Disease didn't care about social class. Death didn't respect wealth. The richest family and the poorest servant faced many of the same medical dangers. And this knowledge, this constant awareness of mortality, shaped the Victorian worldview in profound ways. They were more religious, more accepting of death, more focused on the afterlife, partly because death was so present in their daily experience. The weight of expectation. Beyond the visible routines and the tangible dangers lay something heavier, something harder to name, but impossible to ignore. The Victorian mansion wasn't just a physical structure. It was a set of expectations, a web of social pressures, a performance that never ended. Everyone in that house, from the master to the scullery maid, lived under the weight of specific expectations about who they were supposed to be and how they were supposed to behave. For the women of the house, the pressure was particularly intense. The mistress was expected to manage a complex household while appearing to do nothing at all. She must be accomplished, but not intellectual, refined, but not haughty, beautiful, but not vain, economical, but generous. She must produce children, preferably sons. She must maintain her husband's social status through careful entertaining and impeccable behavior. One scandal, one public mistake, and her reputation, her family's reputation, could be destroyed. The rules governing women's behavior were suffocatingly detailed. A lady didn't walk alone in public. She didn't travel without a companion. She didn't speak to men to whom she hadn't been properly introduced. She kept her voice low, her opinions moderate, her emotions carefully controlled. She fainted at shocking news because that was feminine. She never sweated, only glowed. She maintained impossibly high standards of modesty while wearing dresses cut low enough to display her décolletage at dinner parties. The daughters of the house faced their own pressures. They must be educated enough to converse intelligently, but not so educated as to threaten male authority. They must practice piano and learn to sing and paint watercolors and embroider, demonstrating accomplishments that marked them as marriageable. They must be attractive but not forward, available but not eager, innocent but somehow knowledgeable enough about the world to manage a household once married. Marriage was the goal, the only acceptable goal, and the pressure to marry well was immense. A daughter who didn't marry, or worse, who married beneath her station, brought shame to her family. The season, that complex ritual of balls and parties and social events, existed purely to facilitate advantageous marriages. Young women were paraded, judged, selected, or rejected based on beauty, dowry, family connections, and that indefinable quality called breeding. The master of the house carried his own burden. He must be successful in business while maintaining the fiction that a gentleman didn't work in trade. He must provide for his family, maintain the house and servants, afford the social entertaining his position required. He must be stern but just, commanding respect without losing affection. He must produce an heir, maintain the family name, live up to his father's achievements while somehow surpassing them. Men had more freedom than women, but less than we might imagine. A gentleman's behavior was strictly regulated. He dressed according to specific rules. He conducted business according to accepted practices. He maintained his club memberships, his social connections, his reputation for honesty and reliability. One financial scandal, one public impropriety with a woman not his wife, and his place in society was jeopardized. The servants lived under different but equally rigid expectations. They must be obedient without question, loyal without reward, invisible yet always present, clean despite working in filth, healthy despite terrible working conditions, honest despite poverty wages, respectful despite constant disrespect. The contradiction was inherent in their position. They were expected to be superhuman while being treated as subhuman. Female servants faced additional burdens. They must be virtuous, above suspicion, never involved in any scandal. But they lived and worked in close proximity to male servants and sometimes to the male members of the house. If a footman pursued a housemaid, she was blamed for encouraging him. If the master or his son took liberties with a servant girl, she was still blamed, dismissed, ruined. Her word meant nothing against theirs. Justice wasn't available to her. Pregnancy for an unmarried servant meant instant dismissal, no references, likely destitution. Whether the pregnancy was consensual or forced didn't matter. She had failed in her duty to remain morally pure, and that failure ended her career. Many ended up in workhouses or worse, their children raised by strangers or dying in infancy. The pressure to maintain appearances affected everyone. The family must appear prosperous even if finances were strained. The house must appear perfectly managed even if chaos reigned below stairs. Everyone must seem content even if they were miserable. Complaining, expressing dissatisfaction, showing vulnerability, these were all signs of weakness,
failures of character. This extended to grief and illness. You mourned properly, following the rules, wearing the prescribed clothing, behaving with appropriate solemnness. But you didn't mourn too much, didn't show excessive emotion, didn't let grief interfere with duty. You were ill quietly, recovered quickly, and never discussed unpleasant symptoms. The body was a source of shame, its functions unmentionable, its needs embarrassing. The Victorian mansion was built on repression. Sexual desire was shameful. Anger was unseemly. Joy must be moderate. Laughter was fine, but not too loud, not too often. Everything must be controlled, managed, kept within strict bounds. This affected not just behavior, but emotion itself. The Victorians internalized these rules so thoroughly that breaking them felt wrong, not just socially, but morally.
Religion reinforced all of this. The Church of England preached obedience, humility, acceptance of one's lot. God had placed everyone in their station for a reason. To question that arrangement was to question divine order. Servants were told their work was holy, their suffering would be rewarded in heaven. Women were told their subordination to men reflected God's will. The poor were told their poverty was a test of faith. The wealthy were told their wealth was a sign of God's favor, though they must use it responsibly. The result was a society where almost everyone felt trapped by expectations they didn't choose and couldn't escape. The wealthy were trapped by the need to maintain their position. The servants were trapped by economic necessity. Women were trapped by legal and social restrictions. Men were trapped by the need to be strong, successful, unemotional. Children were trapped by adult expectations that denied them childhood. Some found ways to rebel quietly. A servant might steal small amounts of food or coal, seeing it as fair compensation for poor wages. A woman might read forbidden books or entertain radical ideas in the privacy of her own mind. A man might maintain a separate life at his club or in the city, away from family expectations. But these were small rebellions, barely scratching the surface of the massive structure of social control. The mansion itself embodied these pressures. Its architecture enforced separation. Its routines demanded conformity. Its beauty was built on others' suffering. To live there was to participate in a system that served some and exploited others, and everyone knew it on some level, though they might not admit it even to themselves. Mental breakdowns weren't uncommon among both the wealthy and the servants. The pressure was simply too much for some. They might retreat into illness, real or psychosomatic, as the only acceptable escape. They might take to drink or drugs. They might simply collapse, unable to continue the exhausting performance that every day required. Others endured by numbing themselves, by not thinking too deeply about their circumstances, by focusing on small pleasures or distant hopes. The servant dreamed of saving enough to leave service, to open a shop, to marry. The daughter dreamed of a love match, however unlikely. The mistress lost herself in novels or needlework or religious devotion. The master buried himself in business or club life or his library. Everyone found their own way to survive the crushing weight of being who they were expected to be. Twilight and transformation. As the Victorian era drew toward its close, change was coming, though most people in their grand mansions couldn't yet see it clearly. The world that had seemed so stable, so permanent, so inevitable, was already beginning to crack. The signs were subtle at first, easy to dismiss, but they accumulated, pointing toward a transformation that would sweep away the Victorian mansion and everything it represented. The servant problem became a constant topic of conversation among the wealthy. Good servants were harder to find. They demanded higher wages, more time off, better conditions. Young people who might once have entered service were finding other options. Factory work, though hard, offered more freedom, set hours, escape from the constant oversight that service required. Shop work attracted girls who wanted to see the world beyond a single household's walls. The families grumbled about this. They complained that servants weren't as loyal as they used to be, weren't as willing to work hard, had unreasonable expectations. They didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, that the world was changing. The rigid hierarchy that had seemed natural and permanent was being questioned, slowly at first, then more openly. Technology contributed to this transformation. Electric lights, vacuum cleaners, gas cookers, all these innovations reduced the need for servants, or changed what servants did. A house that once required 30 servants might manage with 20, then 15. Each mechanical improvement put someone out of work, or changed their role fundamentally. The Victorians celebrated progress without recognizing what it was destroying. Social movements challenged the assumptions on which the Victorian mansion was built. The labor movement argued for workers' rights, fair wages, limited hours. The suffrage movement demanded votes for women, recognition of women's full humanity and capabilities. These movements started on the margins, but gradually moved toward the mainstream, carried by people who refused to accept that the old hierarchies were natural or inevitable. Education became more widespread. The children of servants learned to read and write in new public schools. They encountered ideas, possibilities, alternatives to the lives their parents had lived. A girl who could read might not want to scrub floors for tiny wages her whole life. A boy who learned arithmetic might dream of an office job rather than stable work. Education was liberation, and the wealthy were slowly realizing they had created a problem for themselves. The grand houses felt the pressure. Maintaining them became more expensive as wages rose and standards changed. Some families found they could no longer afford the lifestyle their parents had taken for granted. They might close off wings of the house, reduce staff, entertain less, quietly slip down the social ladder. Others held on through careful management and good fortune, but the effort was visible. Then came the First World War, and everything accelerated. The young men, both sons of the families and male servants, went off to fight. Many didn't return. The women, both ladies and servants, took on new roles, working in factories, serving as nurses, doing jobs previously reserved for men. They proved they were capable of far more than anyone had imagined, and they didn't forget it when the war ended. The war shattered the sense that life would continue indefinitely in familiar patterns. The carnage was too great, the loss too profound, the change too fundamental. The men who survived came back different, unable to slip back into the old roles, questioning the authorities that had sent them to die in trenches. The women who had tasted independence resisted returning to their previous constraints. After the war, many of the great houses closed entirely or were converted to other uses: schools, hospitals, hotels, anything that might generate income. The families moved to smaller houses, easier to maintain with fewer servants. The American heiresses who had propped up so many noble families with their industrial wealth weren't as available or as interested. The whole elaborate structure of Victorian society had been revealed as fragile, temporary, ultimately unsustainable. The servants who remained found themselves with more bargaining power. They could demand wages that kept pace with inflation. They could insist on time off, on reasonable hours, on basic dignity. Or they could leave and find work elsewhere because options existed that hadn't before. Service became a choice rather than the only choice, and that changed everything. Looking back now, we can see how inevitable this all was. A system that concentrated so much wealth in so few hands while requiring so many to labor for so little couldn't last forever. The injustice was too glaring, the contradictions too stark. But to the people living through it, the Victorian mansion and the world it represented seemed eternal. They couldn't imagine anything else. They thought this was just how things were and always would be. The mansion itself, the physical building, often survived longer than the way of life it housed. Many Victorian houses still stand, converted, modernized, divided into apartments, serving new purposes. You can visit some as museums, the servants' quarters, the grand public rooms, and the technological innovations that once seemed so advanced. But what you can't see is the life that filled those spaces, the routines that structured every day, the relationships that bound master and servant, the expectations that shaped everyone within those walls. That world is gone. The people who lived it are gone. The assumptions that made it possible are gone. We live in a different world with different problems and possibilities. We've gained much, lost something, and maybe haven't fully understood what that transformation meant. The Victorian mansion was the peak of a certain arrangement of wealth, power, and labor. It couldn't last, didn't last. But while it existed, it shaped the lives of everyone who passed through its doors. So, as we reach the end of this long walk through Victorian domestic life, what stays with you? Perhaps it's the cold that permeated everything, the endless labor that made comfort possible, the strict rules that governed every interaction. Perhaps it's the contradiction of beauty built on suffering, of elegance made possible by exhaustion, of one person's leisure purchased with another person's life. The Victorian mansion was real. The people in it were real. Their joys, struggles, compromises, and sorrows were real. They weren't just characters in a costume drama. They were humans trying to live within the constraints of their time, making the best choices they could from limited options, finding meaning and connection where they could. Some were kind, some were cruel, and most were complicated mixtures of both. They deserve to be remembered not just for the architecture they built or the fortunes they accumulated, but for the lives they actually lived, moment by moment, day by day, in the cold morning and the gaslit evening, above stairs and below. If this glimpse into their world has brought you any peace, any calm, any rest, then it has served its purpose. History isn't just about great events and famous people. It's also about ordinary days, routine work, and small kindnesses. It's about understanding how people lived, what they valued, and what they struggled with. The Victorian mansion gives us a window into a world very different from ours, but connected to it through the chain of time. So, let these images drift away as you drift toward sleep. The grand facade, the servant stairs, the elaborate dinners, the coal smoke and gas lights, all of it receding into the past where it belongs. Rest now, knowing that those lives were lived, those struggles were real, and their world, for all its flaws and all its strangeness, was home to people who felt and thought much as we do. Like and subscribe if these calm explorations of the past help you rest. Your support keeps this channel going, keeps these stories being told. And leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight, what time zone, what thoughts this particular journey through Victorian domestic life has sparked for you. Knowing you're out there, drifting off to the same quiet history, makes this work worthwhile. Sleep well. The mansion has closed its doors for the night, the fires are banked, and even the servants have finally found their rest.